Good morning, everyone. How are you, and welcome back. Today we'll be starting off with a panel titled Pan-Africanism Across the Divides. It will be moderated by Professor Jean Allman, and it will include Professor of History of Africa and the African Diaspora at the University of Chichester, Hakim Adi, Robert Vinson, Director of the Carter Woodson Institute, University of Virginia, Tachwa Manu, Professor Emirata, Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana, and Mjiba Freywood, Research Fellow, Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. I would now like to welcome the moderator, Jean Allman.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's a pleasure and a privilege to moderate this panel on Pan-Africanism across the divides. Special thanks, we have to start with thanks this morning, to my co-conveners, Karina Akoswem Frimpong, to the Institute, to Hor for her incredible support for the Africa Institute project, to all the Africa Institute folks, Salah, Satan, Sarah, Salma, Mariam, and many more. And especially to my colleagues who accepted this invitation. I sort of came up with the dream team of people I'd like to have explore this question, and they all said yes. So that was pretty cool, especially during these very uncertain and insanely busy times. So this panel is about Pan-Africanism as a radical political project. Some will date the origins of Pan-Africanism to the late 18th century. Some look at all the way to the later 19th century. Others look to the Italian invasion as recently as the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Now, when I was 18, I was lucky enough to take a freshman course with Professor Sterling Stuckey. And what Sterling said in one of his first lectures was that the European slave ship was the incubator of Pan-Africanism. And that Pan-Africanism was birthed with the departure of that first ship carrying so-called human cargo from the coast of Africa. And that's the image that I've held on to for so many years. Now, you can trace Pan-Africanism through the major historical world events. You can look at the Haitian Revolution, smaller things like Chief Sam's movement, which featured yesterday. You can look at the Pan-African Congresses. You can look through radical newspapers like those edited by T. Thomas Fortune. Though far more difficult, you can trace it through everyday acts of solidarity and resistance that began the moment a slave ship set sail. Now, those of us who attended the March meeting a couple of days ago heard Angela Davis speak at length about freedom as a non-enlightenment or an anti-enlightenment collective vision that in so many ways was a product of an international Black radical imagination, of which I would argue Pan-Africanism has been a central part. It's a vision of freedom that has animated all kinds of struggles across the globe for over 2 centuries. Now, you can date the origins of Pan-Africanism, you can debate them for a long time, but I think few would dispute the fact that Ghana, especially beginning in 1957, was a transformative place. Ghanaian independence began a transformative time in the development of Pan-Africanism. As Nkrumah announced famously at independence, the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. So Ghana welcomed Pan-Africanism home beginning in 1957. Ghana helped render the continent not just a place of departure in the formation of a Pan-African diaspora, but insisted on the centrality of the continent itself in the making of a radical Pan-African world. Those years, especially 57 to 66, in those, Ghana appeared to many as a country of the future, one that faced neither east nor west, only faced forward. This morning, through the work of 4 extraordinary scholars, we will explore the pasts, the presents, and the futures of Pan-Africanism, including the tensions, contradictions, and challenges it has faced, with particular reference to Ghana. Please do look at the full biographies of our panelists, which can be found in the program. Check them out. I don't want to repeat Satan has gone through the list. It appears here. I just wanted to note, in case they don't know it themselves, that 2 of our panelists are actually PhDs from the history department at Howard University. So there we go, okay. So we will start with Dr. Hakim Adi. Thank you.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. And first of all, I have to apologize for not feeling very well today, and so my voice might disappear. But I'm going to try and do my best to say something about this important subject of Pan-Africanism. I'm going to look at a particular period, in fact, leading up to the independence of Ghana in 1957, although I will also comment on the first years of independence and the efforts of Ghana, Nkrumah, Padmore, and others to develop a new form of Pan-Africanism on the African continent. First of all, I wanted to say something about Pan-Africanism, or how I understand Pan-Africanism. People will have different views. I think you can all see that, so I'm not going to waste my voice, as it were, by reading it out. But my conception of Pan-Africanism is that it's rather like a mighty river with many different streams and currents. And so it appears in different forms at different times according to the particular challenges which face those of Africa and the African diaspora. And Jean gave us a kind of potted history in her introductory remarks. It's worth bearing in mind, especially as we've just celebrated International Women's Day, that the modern Pan-African movement was founded by a woman. And this is something that's often forgotten. But the origins of the modern movement, which began in the 1890s in Britain, of course, began with Alice Kinloch. She inspired both the founding of the African Association and also inspired the convening of the first Pan-African Conference, which was held in London, as everybody knows, in 1900. And throughout its early development in the 20th century, Pan-Africanism attempted to broaden itself, to address those divisions which existed, and the most important division which it tried to heal, if you like, and to form a bridge was between those in the African continent and those in the diaspora. But even that relationship was one that had its limitations. And as you'll probably know, it was very often difficult to include those from North Africa. The movement tended to be largely Anglophone, although at various times there were Francophone aspects of it. It found it difficult to link up with those in Latin America and so on, who constitute a very important part of the African diaspora. So Pan-Africanism, as it emerged as an organized movement in the 20th century, always had its limitations. And during that period, as I say, there were attempts to broaden it, most notably with W.E.B. Du Bois' attempt to hold a Congress in Africa in Tunis, which unfortunately did not come to fruition. But there were other instances of, as I say, a broadening of the movement, particularly during the 1930s with the conferences of Africans and Arabs that were held in Paris during that period. Okay, so to move on and to bring us closer to the time period I'm particularly interested in, I always start off from the convening of the Manchester Pan-African Congress in 1945. As you're aware, this was a congress in which Nkrumah participated, in fact was one of the organizers of this Congress, along with others, George Padmore and others who I'll say more about later. And There are many things that can be said about the Manchester Congress as a particularly important development in the history of Pan-Africanism. And I'm not sure whether you can see the slogans that are attached to various walls in Manchester, so I may read some of them out to you. Obviously, there are those like oppressed people of the world unite, freedom for all subject peoples, Arabs and Jews unite against British imperialism, and of course Padmore's favourite, labour in the white skin cannot emancipate itself while labour in the black skin is enslaved. Now, the importance of these slogans and the character of the Congress was that it was not just concerned with the unity and liberation of Africans, but with a more general internationalist unity and struggle. In fact, they had the conception of, as we'd say today, one humanity, one struggle, although they presented it in the language of the time. So this was a very important development in the history of Pan-Africanism. Indeed, before the Manchester Congress took place, as I said, largely organized by George Padmore and the Pan-African Federation in Britain, they had also organized two subject peoples conferences where African organizations allied with Indian organizations, organizations from Burma, Ceylon, and other places. So they developed a kind of Afro-Asian unity in the context of developing this Pan-Africanism in 1945. And Nkrumah was very much, and others, were very much part of this thinking. And if you look at the proceedings of the 1945 Congress, they talk not only about struggles in Africa, the Caribbean, the US, but also those in Vietnam, Malaya, India, and various other places. So this was the character of this new Pan-Africanism. Okay, now I'm going to deal with some of the declarations of that Congress, just to kind of introduce some of the significant thinking at that time. The first that I want to mention, I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but the first, which I think is important, is that they decided that as opposed to other political interventions in the past, that the use of force was a necessary requirement, or might be a necessary requirement, that the end of the colonial rule could not be brought about by excluding the use of force, the use of violence, as you can see there, even if force destroys them and the world, and so on and so forth. So that was an important development. Secondly, they took a very clear stand on what we could say economic questions. And one doesn't have to read all of this, probably just the first sentence is enough. They were very clearly opposed to what they called the monopoly of capital, the rule of private wealth, etc., etc., etc. So they took a very clear political position against the capital-centered system, against imperialism, and so on. And I don't have time to go into why they took that particular stand, but you can say that they drew from their own experience as to not only that they were opposed to this system, but that in a future Africa, this would be something which they would take a stand against and build an independent Africa which was free of imperialist control and so on. And then in the Declaration to Colonial Farmers, Workers and Intellectuals, and these were essentially worked out by Nkrumah and Padmore. Nkrumah later said that he had written one of them, but anyway, they were probably joint efforts. Again, I just want to draw your attention to probably the last sentence here, the idea that people of the colonies must fight for these ends, that's the end of colonial rule, the right to self-government, by all means at their disposal. So there is no limitation on what means should be used for independence and freedom and so on. The other important aspect of this Congress was that, as you can see from the second paragraph here, that they put the workers as they would have said at that time, the masses of the people in first place. And this was a significant change from previous congresses. In fact, Padmore wrote to Du Bois and explained to him that now we need to concentrate on the workers. Long gone are the days where the Pan-African movement needed professors and intellectuals to tell it what to do. So this conception that the workers, farmers, were at the forefront of the struggle against imperialism were extremely important. And as you can see, that it says, it highlights the weapons that the masses of the people might use: strikes, boycotts, and so on and so forth. In this slide, you can see that they very clearly indicate the role of intellectuals and professionals who have particular responsibilities, but the key emphasis is on the organization of the masses of the people. And of course, if you take that to its logical conclusion, it has also significant repercussions about what kind of state you establish after independence, but that's perhaps another subject. And it ends with colonial and subject peoples of the world unite. So again, this kind of internationalism was very much a key part of the Congress. So this, I'm saying, is a new kind of Pan-Africanism, developed in the conditions of the post-war period, and also summing up the experience of the whole movement. They didn't just say the masses are important just because they felt like it. They summed up the experience of the whole movement from the 1930s to the 1940s. And in fact, just before this Congress had taken place, there was a general strike in Nigeria, which had brought what was then Britain's biggest colony in Africa. It brought the whole country to a standstill. So they understood that if you organize the majority, the working people, it's a kind of irresistible force that the colonial powers would be unable to withstand. And of course, they look back to the cocoa hold-ups of the 1930s and so on. Okay, so the next stage in the development of this new Pan-Africanism was the formation of the West African National Secretariat in Britain. And as you can see from this photo, this is not, we could say, not exactly a photo of the West African National Secretariat, but it's the best we can do. And you can see in this some notable characters. I won't name all of them. Seated, bottom right, you can see Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first General Secretary of the West African National Secretariat. Next to him, Bankole Awoonarena, some of you will be familiar with. Seated second from the left, is another very important character, Isaac Wallace Johnson, who'd recently been released from prison by the British authorities, and he became the first president of the West African National Secretariat. And there are others there, some of you will recognize. I won't go into all of them now. So what was the significance of in the West African National Secretariat in this new form of Pan-Africanism? It included people like Kojo Botsio, Ashi Nkoe, and others, many, many, many others, who then later went on to play prominent roles in Ghanaian politics. There are a number of key things about it. One is it was an organization organizing and agitating for, I guess they would have said, a united West Africa. They had the conception that you have to organize West Africa first, even a federal West Africa. They talked about a West African state, and they wanted to include within that West African state the French colonies, or what were then French colonies as well. In this West African state, there would be the boundaries would be broken down. And I forgot to say that that was one of the significant things about the Manchester Congress. Not only did it say that the masses of the people should be in first place and oppose the monopoly of capital, it also opposed the colonial boundaries as well as what it called the alien political institutions imposed by colonial rule. So they, in the spirit of breaking down these colonial boundaries, tried to organize a West African state, or they looked forward to organizing a West African state. And one of the things which they did, or which Nkrumah did, they had discussions, talks with their counterparts in Paris, in France, with the aim of organizing a West African Congress in Lagos in 1948. That Congress didn't actually take place for various reasons, but that was certainly the aim, to organize in West Africa, or organize West Africans first, to organize in West Africa first, to develop some kind of federal setup. In fact, you could almost say based around the earlier National Congress of British West Africa, and then that would be the basis for a wider Pan-African unity throughout the entire continent. They also, or at least some of them, had a conception of what they called a West African Soviet Union, and Awan Arena actually wrote a whole pamphlet on this West African Soviet Union. So they incorporated a number of interesting ideas, including Marxism, Marxist socialism, we can say, as well as this conception of a West African state. So in 1947, Nkrumah returned from Britain to the Gold Coast, and we could say that Pan-Africanism kind of returned with him, in the sense that the Pan-Africanism which he developed, or helped to develop, as part of the West African National Secretariat and the Manchester Congress, came with him. I won't go into his political activities within the Gold Coast as such, apart from reminding you that he became leader of government business in 1951. And from that time onwards, there began to be plans for a new Pan-African Congress in West Africa, in the Gold Coast. There were various reasons why this couldn't take place, but there were plans for it from 1951 onwards. And Nkrumah worked very closely with Padmore. Padmore was in the Gold Coast from that period, not entirely, but for much of this period, preparing for such a Congress, and also preparing the Convention People's Party as a kind of Pan-African organization. Padmore rewrote part of the CPP's constitution to give it that character and to argue that it should work very closely with organizations in other African countries. But although a Pan-African Congress could not be organized, Nkrumah carried on this West African orientation by organizing the, I won't say famous, but important Kumasi Conference in 1953. And the Kumasi Conference in 1953 was supposed to be the preparatory event for a wider Pan-African Congress in 1954, which did not take place. And in fact, holding the Kumasi Conference was extremely difficult. Clearly, Ghana was not yet independent. The British colonial authorities made it very difficult. The French colonial authorities made it even more difficult. So in fact, very few people attended, or very few delegates attended, though delegates did attend from Sierra Leone, from Nigeria, from Liberia. There were some African Americans present and so on. And again, what was emphasized was this idea of a West African state as a precursor to a wider United States of Africa. And amongst those who spoke of that Congress, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Fumi Ransome Kuti, as well as local figures who I won't mention now. Even after that Kumasi Conference, which was quite an important step for Nkrumah and for Padmore, there were plans to hold a sixth Pan-African Congress in the Gold Coast. And in fact, at that time, there were demands from such a Congress from the African National Congress. Walter Sisulu wrote to Nkrumah asking when are we going to hold this Congress? But it didn't take place, and it was one of the, I wouldn't say compromises that the CPP made, but they decided that the achievement of independence had to be developed first, or had to be brought to fruition first, before such a Congress could take place. And that, as everybody knows, occurred in March 1957, and as Jean has already reminded us, Nkrumah made his now well-known speech about the independence of Ghana being meaningless unless it was linked to the liberation of the entire African continent. And it was following that independence that this attempts to develop a Pan-African Congress on African soil for the first time really took off. And I couldn't find at short notice in my hotel room a picture of the first conference of independent African states that took place in early 1958, so I'm going to use this one instead, because this poster for the All African Peoples Conference, which I'll speak about in a moment, gives you an illustration of who these independent African states were at that time, because you can see them pictured here. And what you immediately notice about them is that most of them are in North Africa. And so this first very important Pan-African gathering in Ghana in 1958 was mainly a gathering of those in those North African states. And so it was important in, you could say, overcoming that divide, which hitherto maybe had existed. It was also important for, I suppose, Nkrumah's presentation of the idea of African, or the African, or an African personality, and for the support which was given by all of those who gathered together for the struggle of Algeria and the FLN against French colonialism, which was going on at that time. Of course, out of that Congress, Padmore and Nkrumah toured all of those countries, all of those independent African states throughout 1958, trying to consolidate that unity which had been developed during the conference. And then they prepared for the perhaps more famous and more important All-African Peoples Conference, which occurred in December of 1958. Now, this is also from the All-African Peoples Conference publicity, and I'm showing it here because it clearly shows the hand of Padmore. Padmore organized both of those conferences. This is a picture some of you may be familiar with from the 1930s, when George Padmore was a leading communist and one of the leading figures in the international communist movement. And it was used for a variety of purposes. It's most famously connected with a publication called Negro Worker. But Padmore presumably liked the image, and so he used it for All African Peoples Conference as well. It's also worth just mentioning on the subject of Padmore that, of course, from this period he became Nkrumah's official advisor on African affairs. And in 1959, the Bureau of African Studies was established, African Affairs, was established, which, amongst other things, hosted and encouraged and trained those fighting for freedom in other parts of Africa to come to Ghana, and was under Padmore's leadership. Okay, so then to say a little bit more about the All African Peoples Conference. It was a conference for organizations of youth, women, workers. It included a whole number of people who were part of political organizations struggling for independence in Africa at that time. People like Lumumba, Mumie, Fanon, of course, was also there. It also included those from the US, Eslanda Robeson attended, Shirley Graham Du Bois was there, and many, many others. It's kind of gone down in history as a historic conference in the sense that it united lots of different organizations throughout the continent. But it signaled a time when divisions began to emerge within this new Pan-Africanism that was being established on the African continent. And I'm just going to mention two very, very quickly. If you look down at the bottom, the last paragraph, it says, the conference will formulate and proclaim our African personality based on the philosophy of Pan-African socialism and the ideology of African nonviolent revolution. Well, that was a position developed by Nkrumah and the CPP that wasn't shared by everybody. And the conference now has gone down in history as one in which Frantz Fanon intervened and said that, obviously as a consequence of the armed struggle in Algeria, this idea of nonviolence is nonsense, or words to that effect, and that Africans fighting for freedom should use any means necessary. There were also other divisions, particularly regional ones, particularly involving those in East and Central Africa, who'd established their own organization during this period, Pan-Africanism. And so even though these are seen as the kind of height of Pan-Africanism being established on the African continent, they already included within them seeds of divisions for the future. And as you're aware, those divisions continued after 1958, all the way until the development of the Organized African Unity in 1963. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jean, Kosia, and Karina, and everyone with the Africa Institute for inviting me here. I'm happy to be here. I have one disclaimer. I am sleep deprived. I have not slept at all last night because my strategy yesterday of taking a short nap yesterday morning was a failure. I slept the whole day and missed the whole first day of the conference. So my strategy was not to sleep at all. So I am literally sleep deprived, but I'm going to hopefully move through this talk within my 20 minutes. I'm watching you, Taj, and I will start. So the talk is, and it's it moves nicely from Hakeem's talk, because my talk is entitled Black Star, Albert Lutuli's African National Congress, the formation of the Pan-Africanist Congress of South Africa, and the promise and peril of Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism. And this derives partially from my second book on Albert Lutuli, ANC president from 1952 to 1967, Africa's first Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1961, and much of the historiography of the South African freedom struggle focuses on the ANC. And this is largely the result of historians, but also the current ANC, the current governing party of South Africa, sort of collapsing the liberation struggle into the story of the ANC. And so much of that, so other organizations like the Pan-Africanist Congress have been sidelined in the historiography of South Africa. We do know something about the Pan-Africanist Congress in Ghana itself after 1960. Most of us know about Sharpeville, the PAC campaign against pass laws in 1960, but there's comparatively less information on the actual formation of the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1959. And what I want to do here is talk a bit more about the so-called Africanist split within the ANC that is often told in South African historiography, not even as a national story, but really a provincial story, a rupture within the Transvaal ANC, one of the 4 provinces of South Africa. And this paper links the provincial story of the Transvaal ANC and the split within it that led to the PAC, actually connects it to a larger African transnational story. And what I want to do here is to not only move South Africa out of its still sort of parochial framing, but also the work that does look at South African history in a transnational frame tends to be transoceanic, tends to be transatlantic, or connecting into the Indian Ocean world. And what's often neglected is the idea of a transnational South African history that's connected to the African continent itself. And so in this talk, what I want to do is connect South Africa with Ghana, right? And to understand how we can think about this transnational history, developing this history within the African continent itself. So that is sort of the opening. And the argument of the paper is that the newly independent Ghana, which was obviously a Pan-Africanist beacon of decolonization for the ANC, nevertheless inspired dissident Africanists within the ANC to leave this venerable, nearly a half-century-old organization. Independent Ghana provided somewhere to go outside the ANC. I'm convinced that Africa's Black Star, independent Ghana, provided a more relevant and viable path to fulfill the popular anti-apartheid slogan, free by 63. And so, in considering Albert Luthuli, this venerable statesman who was able to hold together disparate parts of the ANC rather successfully over his 15-year presidency, this was, if you will, a notable exception. He was not able to hold together these various groupings within the ANC, causing this rupture. And much of this had to do with interpretations of Pan-Africanism, the inspirational example of Ghana, and this rupture that happened in 1958. Okay, so that is my opening statement, and then I will read this paper, hopefully with a little verve. On March 6, 1957, during Ghana's independence ceremonies, Kwame Nkrumah proclaimed, and I'm quoting, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of the African continent." This proclamation set the tone for Ghana's continental Pan-Africanism and anti-apartheid foreign policy, a stance welcomed by Albert Luthuli, longstanding president of the ANC, and as I said, the first African-born recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in December 1961. In Luthuli's first presidential address at the ANC annual conference in December 1953, he framed South African anti-apartheid politics as, and I'm quoting, "as part of the liberatory movement in the whole of Africa. In this connection, I am happy to say that the ANC is already interesting itself in the proposition of a Pan-African conference. We welcome the interest taken in the matter by the Prime Minister of the Gold Coast, Mr. Nkrumah," unquote. Nkrumah's direct action anti-colonial stance in the Gold Coast had partially inspired the ANC's just concluded Defiance Campaign, a nonviolent civil disobedience endeavor that, because of Luthuli's prominent role in that campaign in 1952 into 1953, had propelled Luthuli to the ANC presidency, a presidency that he would hold until his death in 1967. Luthuli's reference to Nkrumah was part of his own contextualization of South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle within continental Pan-Africanism and the global context of Asian, African, and Caribbean decolonization. While Luthuli was jailed at the time of Ghana's independence, and this was because of his involvement with the Freedom Charter, he was tried along with 155 other anti-apartheid activists in the treason trial in South Africa. The ANC nevertheless celebrated Ghana's independence as proof that and I'm quoting, "a new, rejuvenated, and a dynamic Mother Africa will be born, opening the gate that the rest of colonial Africa has to march with greater optimism on the road to freedom." In April 1958, the Conference of Independent States in Accra, attended by the 8 independent African countries at the time, fulfilled Luthuli's earlier reference to Nkrumah's plan of a Pan-African conference, what became the first Pan-African conference on African soil. It marked the progress of African independence movements and the determination of anti-colonial movements to achieve freedom. And notably, Ghana insisted that the necessary precondition for apartheid South Africa's participation in that conference was for it to immediately dismantle apartheid. Of course, the apartheid regime refused, and the Ghanaians duly excluded them from the conference. In short, Lutuli's ANC had long been attuned to the Pan-African currents emanating from Ghana, the Black Star of Africa. Yet, for Lutuli's ANC, the promise of Pan-African Ghana proved also to be a peril, inspiring an organizational split that led to the eventual formation of the rival Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, in April 1959. And so very briefly, this road to this rupture within the ANC has a longer genealogy, but the immediate history is the Freedom Charter in 1955. And on June 26th of that year, 1955, the Lutuli ANC led a multiracial coalition of anti-apartheid organizations known as the Congress Alliance in the creation of the Freedom Charter, which became a concrete roadmap to a non-racial democratic South Africa. The current Constitution of South Africa borrows heavily from the Freedom Charter. The Charter, of course, demanded that all South African citizens have the right to own land, to be able to vote and hold office, to enjoy legal equality, and to exercise full economic and educational rights, the freedom of speech, movements and assembly, and liberal democratic institutions. It also called for land redistribution through widespread individual land ownership, limited government intervention in the economy, and selective nationalization of mines and banks. And Lutuli felt that this Freedom Charter joined the UN Declaration of Human Rights as another timeless document that provided a basis for the continuing struggle for freedom and human dignity against racial oppression. However, an increasingly restive Africanist bloc of the ANC, including AP Imda, Peter Ramahono, Robert Sobukwe, Peter Molotsi, and Polako Labalo, objected to the Freedom Charter's multiracial declarations embodied in this phrase: "The land belongs to all who live in it, black and white." And the Africanists claimed that this deviated from the more explicit African self-determination and nationalism of earlier documents, including the African Claims 1944 and the 1949 Program of Action, that asserted the primacy of African rights over other groups of people based on original land occupation and their demographic majority. So for the Africanists, the Freedom Charter's multiracialism reflected the strong influence of white communists that were part of that Congress alignment. And they objected to the term multiracialism, which they felt legitimized apartheid's obsession with supposed racial difference. And again, it diluted the idea of the primary claim of Africans to the country. And so their version of Pan-Africanism argued for Africa for the Africans, based on the sense of a common history of land dispossession, colonialism, labor exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. This language of multiracialism, this claim of the land belongs to all, black and white, seemed to place other groups, including whites, the oppressors, on the same plane in terms of rights. Right? And so the Africanists objected to this because for them, this was a violation of the Pan-Africanism that they understood. Okay. So the Africanists posed a growing internal challenge to Lutuli and the Congress Alliance, and they were further inspired by George Padmore's 1956 book, Pan-Africanism or Communism, which denounced communism, and of course Padmore had been a longtime member of the Communist Party and had left the party. And instead, this book, obviously, as we know, declared Pan-Africanism as the pathway to decolonization and continental African independence. And of course, Padmore would soon settle in independent Ghana at the invitation of Nkrumah. All right, 10 minutes, Taj, got it. Right. And so, and in that book, some of us might know, Padmore had explicit criticism of the Communist Party of South Africa as an obstacle to African nationalism. And this was really mandatory reading for Africans within the ANC, right? So they're reading this, and this is sort of, along with Nkrumah and the imminent independence of Ghana, Pan-Africanism, communism as a text was really important for Africanists in South Africa to further think through ways to reorient the ANC toward their version and vision of Pan-Africanism. And failing that, thinking through how to leave the ANC altogether and create a new formulation. And so now moving forward to November 1958, the Transvaal Provincial ANC Conference. And remember again, South Africa has 4 provinces. Each province has their own provincial ANC. And so in the Transvaal, this was the major provincial ANC. And it was here in this conference in November of 1958 where a rupture happens. And so despite these increasingly strident Africanist complaints about the direction of the ANC, before this conference in June of 1958, Luthuli had expressed little concern over this dissident faction. He said, and I'm quoting, "I don't regard the Africanists as a serious problem within the ANC. They do exist, but not as a challenge meriting constant attention. The ANC should strongly pursue its policy of cooperation with other racial groups and win the African people to that point of view. That is the only sound policy." And here I think Luthuli, who I think was an extraordinary statesman on many levels, was really underestimating this undercurrent of Pan-Africanism within the organization. He did not foresee this rupture that was coming. And so on November 1st, 1958, at the opening of this Transvaal Provincial Conference in Orlando, outside of Johannesburg, he again affirms his view that the multiracial Congress alliance was the most effective means to end apartheid. And as a model for the post-apartheid state, the strongest guarantor of a sustainable, democratic, inclusive, non-racial South Africa. He denounced the Nationalist Party, the ruling party of apartheid, the Nationalist Party's racialism, claiming that it was injecting, and I'm quoting, "the virus of prejudice and sectionalism into Africanists," who he claimed were trying to, quoting, "emulate the nationalists in claiming exclusive control of South Africa with a dangerously narrow African nationalism, which itself tends to encourage us to go back to a tribalism mentality," unquote. So to this, about 50 Africanists entered the hall and where Luthuli was speaking. And they heckled Luthuli supporters who affirmed Africa is for all. And the Africanists had rejoinders that Africa is for the Africans, and the white man must go back to Europe, unquote. So these long-standing internal tensions were about to boil over. And the next morning, November 2nd, before elections for key national executive positions within the ANC, over 100 ANC volunteers with sticks and pieces of iron guarded the door as a similarly numbered group of Africanists clustered outside. The Africanists remained frustrated in their ambitions to win a majority of national executive posts. They had hoped to win the majority of posts to reorient the ANC toward their point of view, toward their idea of Pan-Africanism. But ultimately, current executive members of the ANC expelled those Africanists, including 2 prominent ones, Josiah Mazunya and Polako Labalo, from the ANC for their loud objections to the Congress alliance. And so on November 8th, 1958, understanding that there was an upcoming All-African Peoples Conference in Accra, Ghana, the very next month, the Africanists confirmed their secession from the ANC. Now, it just so happens that the ANC National Conference ran on December 14th and 15th, 1958, and that was just after the AAPC, which was from December 5th to 1913. From December 5th to December 13th. I told you I was sleep deprived. Okay. So here, Luthuli is still arguing that the Africanist version of African nationalism was nothing more than Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd's policy of development along their own lines. Of course, Hendrik Verwoerd is the Prime Minister of apartheid South Africa. And Luthuli later laments the Africanist position. I'm quoting, "Those who say Africa for the Africans are not realistic. Where would the whites of South Africa go? This is also their home. It is of no use to argue that they shouldn't have come. They are here, and that is an inescapable fact," unquote. Of course, such sentiments seemed increasingly outdated as Pan-Africanism was sweeping across the continent, emboldening the Africanists to seek continental alliances outside of South Africa. The ANC annual conference happened, as I said, just after the AAPC in Ghana. And of the approximately 200 delegates from 36 different organizations at the AAPC, exiled South African writer Ezekiel Mpopalele, and the white American Mary Louise Hooper, who had worked for Luthuli in South Africa before being expelled from the country, represented the ANC. Mary Louise Hooper is a very interesting person. I'll just say it very quickly. She's a white American Quaker who spent several years in South Africa, and she represented the ANC at all African conferences, not only in Accra, but in Tunis in 1960 and Cairo in 1961. While she worked with the NAACP, and she seemed to be a very sincere anti-apartheid activist for many years until her death in the early 1980s, the fact that she was white, I think, led further credence to Pan-Africanists that whites had an undue influence within the ANC. So I'm going to move forward, because I know Taj is about to raise his sign to me. So I'm going to move forward rather quickly. But what I want to point out here is that for Nkrumah, the AAPC, the conference was to facilitate a Pan-African movement of Gandhian nonviolent tactics, mass mobilization, economic sanctions, and diplomatic isolation against colonialism and imperialism that could lead to a unified continental government and African democratic socialism. The AAPC also targeted 1963 as a date for African liberation, inspiring the popular South African call to be free by '63. And of course, the AAPC included condemnatory resolutions against forced labor in colonial states like Angola, Mozambique, the Belgian Congo, Southwest Africa, and of course, South Africa, which came in for additional criticism for their anti-apartheid policies. Nkrumah backed diplomatic isolation and comprehensive economic sanctions against South Africa and a boycott of South African goods. Ironically, all policies that were in line with the Luthuli ANC. Now, ANC leaders like Luthuli did disagree with the AAPC's proclamation of an African personality based on the philosophy of Pan-Africanist socialism as a guiding ideal of African decolonization and independence. The ANC leadership argued still for South African exceptionalism, pointing out that South Africa's large white population, by far the largest on the continent, necessitated a broader African nationalism that included non-Africans in the fight to create a multiracial society. They also argued that this African personality in Pan-Africanist socialism also excluded Asians, and that the AAPC should adopt instead the broader Afro-Asian anti-colonial front called for at the 1955 Bandung Conference. But despite this disagreement, Luthuli remained optimistic that South Africa would also be free, just by slightly different means. But meanwhile, the Africanists adopted fully the AAPC's Pan-Africanist vision and cast further aspersions on the ANC's multiracial alliance. And now coming to the close. So the Africanists have left the ANC in 1958, November 1958. The AAPC conference happens the next month. And in April of 1959, the Africanists formulate the Pan-Africanist Congress. So inspired by the AAPC, the Africanists gathered on April 4th through the 6th, 1959 to create the Pan-Africanist Congress. And the very name, we often skip over this, the very name tells us that they are deliberately placing themselves in this longer historical trajectory of Pan-Africanism that, as Hakeem mentioned, goes back to the late 19th century. It demonstrates the influence of Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism. And as Gail Gerhardt notes in her classic study, Black Power in South Africa, she says, the formulations of Accra came as inspiration to the PAC's leaders at exactly the stage when they were seeking ways to reinforce and justify nationalist ideology. The PAC closed their founding conference on April 6, 1959, on Van Riebeck Day, the apartheid regime's holiday that valorized the beginning of South African settler colonialism, the 1652 landing of Jan Van Riebeck and the Dutch East India Company at present-day Cape Town. PAC President Robert Sobukwe intoned, and I'm quoting, "Today, 307 years ago, began the act of aggression against the sons and daughters of Africa, by which the African people were dispossessed of their land and subjected to white domination. As it was here, and on this day that it began, it is imperative that it should be here, and on this day that it should be buried," unquote. So PAC leaders linked their fight against settler colonialism to larger Pan-African currents as they triumphantly read congratulatory telegrams from Nkrumah and Guinean President Sékou Touré. The PAC manifesto proclaimed that, I'm quoting, the African people of South Africa recognize themselves as part of one African nation, stretching from Cape to Cairo, Madagascar to Morocco, and pledged themselves to strive and work ceaselessly to find organizational expression for this nation in a merger of free, independent states into a United States of Africa, unquote. They also proclaimed that they would adopt Nkrumah's positive neutrality as their own foreign policy, adopted Nkrumah's African personality as their own social and cultural goal, and declared that its flag would depict a green field with a black map of Africa and a Ghana-based gold star that radiated lights of freedom throughout Africa. That is still the flag of the Pan-Africanist Congress. With this short paper, then, I hope to have focused more attention on the PAC so that South African struggle history is not synonymous with the ANC. And in this quick summation of the promise and peril of Ghana's Pan-Africanism for Black South Africans, we can consider again, a transnational South African history that is not only transoceanic, but within the African continent. We can consider a conceptualization of Black internationalism that is centered in Africa with African actors. And then we can also consider, in this period before 1960, that activists can be aligned, even if they don't share the same physical space, they occupy the same intellectual and conceptual space. So I'm thinking about this idea of space beyond the physical, thinking about shared space in this way. And I think we can return Pan-Africanism to African origins. As Hakeem mentioned, African origins with Mary Kinloch, a South African woman who established the African Association with members from Southern Africa, East Africa, Trinidad, Barbados, and what became the Gold Coast. So that South African Gold Coast connection that began with Alice Kinloch comes full circle with this connection, the founding of the PAC and the influence of Kwame Nkrumah's Black Star. Thank you so much for listening.
I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to join this panel. I want to speak on Ghana, Pan-Africanism, and the Afro-Arab and Afro-Asian worlds. And I start with a short prologue on a Black Iraqi's Southern career in TV news, subtitled, They wanted to see all colors. So Randa Abdel Al-Aziz was joking with friends in a Baghdad cafe when she got a surprise job offer broadcasting the news in Iraq, whose Black citizens have little media presence and even less power. Ms. Abdul Al-Aziz, 25, is the first Black Iraqi employed on air at the state television news and information channels, at least since the United States toppled Saddam Hussein almost 2 decades ago. I thought it would just be for a few days and they would see it wouldn't work and I would leave, said Ms. Abdul Al-Aziz, who had no prior TV experience and only a passing curiosity about the news media. She brought her mother to the initial meeting with the network. Her hiring last year, that is in 2021, came after a nationwide search by the head of state media, who added her to the network's roster of about 100 news anchors, correspondents, and show hosts. We have in Iraq at least 1.5 million African Iraqis, said Nabil Jassim, 51, the president of the Iraqi Media Network. They need to see themselves reflected on TV. So in this paper, I did interviews with former officials of I did literature reviews of the Pan-Africanist movement, the Bandung and Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organizations, and some contemporary sources as well as interviews with some former officials of Ghana's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to try to put together the shape of relations that Ghana had developed with the Middle East and the broader Afro-Asian region as part of the vision of Pan-Africanism that the Ghanaian state enunciated and championed after independence. And most of these, we know that the Ghanaian state was an active and early member in the debates and movements around the direction of Pan-Africanism, global Southern solidarity, and internationalism. And one of the divides that I think the other two speakers have highlighted has been the sub-Saharan version of Pan-Africanism versus a much more continental and diasporic version of Pan-Africanism that Nkrumah spearheaded. And in those days, when the Third World solidarity was spoken about, it was not about how we see the Third World today as a collection of very poor, underdeveloped countries, but as a viable alternative to the superpower rivalry. And interestingly, I found, for instance, that Nkrumah had sent somebody to stay in Rangoon in the 50s in preparation for the Bandung conference. Very, very interesting, I thought, that much of this history, Jimmy Markham, that we do not even know about. So my paper looks at the state-to-state relations, but in much of my interviews, I was being pushed towards looking at the state of Black people in the Arab world. And I had planned to do it really when it came to looking at labor, contemporary labor migrations, but I was also pushed to this much more historic relations. We know, for instance, that the Ghanaian state has supported the Algerian independence movement against France. Frantz Fanon was the first ambassador of Algeria in Ghana. And of course, Nkrumah instantiated the political is the personal when he married an Egyptian woman as part of this broad vision of Pan-Africanism. So I was wondering, for instance, whether what the PAC's position when you spoke would be on the Arab world as part of this Pan-Africanism, which Nkrumah clearly supported. So we know that the Afro-Arabian worlds have been in constant contact for centuries, primarily through the caravan trade that connected North Africa to West Africa and the Sahel to other parts of Asia Minor. And we also know that enslaved East Africans were taken to different parts of the Arab world from the 9th century AD, a slave trade that lasted more than 1,000 years, and that ended in some Arab countries just decades ago. And of course, there have been the connections through the Islamic centers of learning in Fez and, etc. So the issue of Africans in the Arab world is known, but it's not much of the discourse when it comes to Pan-Africanism. And this is something that in my interviews kept coming back in the kinds of issues that my interviewees were interested in. And when I read the story of this Black Iraqi on TV in the New York Times as part of my readings towards this, it really crystallized for me one of those central divides, but something that we do not really talk about. So in the case of this Miss Abdul Aziz, apparently her hiring had both shocked and bothered a few network employees and viewers. And it highlighted a deeply entrenched racism in Iraq, a country with about 40 million people, but about 1.5 million Africans, as I said earlier. And in that country, Black Iraqis have essentially no political representation. Iraq's parliament does not have a single Black lawmaker. there are almost no senior black officials in government ministries. And as in many other Arab countries, many Iraqis use racial slurs. So whilst this focus is on Iraq, I'm suggesting that it is emblematic of much of what happens across the Arab world. And we know, as I've said, that most members of Iraqi's black community are descendants of enslaved East Africans who were brought to the southern coast of Iraq beginning in the 9th century. And this image, this neighborhood, shows a neighborhood where many of the capital's black families live. It's impoverished, and this is another neighborhood where many black people live. And when black Iraqis appear on television, it is usually as musicians, dancers, or in comedic roles. And according to the producer who hired this lady, he wanted to dispel those stereotypes. So of course we know that we can connect. When I was reading this, I was connecting it with a lot of what had happened in other places. So we know that the Black Lives Matter has spread, the movement has spread across much of the world, but the article suggested that Iraq has only a nascent black rights movement, and there's no consensus among black Iraqis even about what to call themselves. Some reject the terms black or African Iraqi as divisive. Many have settled on the Arabic term asmar, or dark-skinned. And when this TV anchor was asked what she considered the best term, she said simply Iraqi. Iraq is diversity. We have more than one origin. Your nationality is enough. And it went on to show that this lady was the only black student in her class at high school, and a lot of other people. And then there's the whole color issue and the fact that she was being asked by a number of people to use skin lightening creams to lighten her skin. And even if this lady is not bothered, other people who were interviewed were bothered, and some of them were talking about how other Iraqis deal with them as if they were still slaves, said this man who is a journalist, a black journalist, and the co-founder of the Free Iraqis movement, an association founded in 2017 to defend the rights of black Iraqis. And he says that despite years of writing for government newspapers as a freelancer, he had never been employed by many of them. And says, I am a good journalist, but no one ever gave me a chance to work. And the dropout rate among black students is very high because of bullying by both students and teachers. So a survey, admittedly almost a decade old, reported illiteracy rates among black Iraqis at around 80%, a figure more than twice as high as the national average. And another lady said, my aunt could not read or write, but she used to tell me that our school diplomas would be the weapons in our hands, said Tara Yusuf, a black Iraqi who lives in Basra. Miss Yusuf has a doctorate in theater, and she says she's only a handful of black Iraqis in Basra who have a postgraduate degree. If you ask them about Malcolm X, no one will know him, she said. If you cannot read, you cannot search the internet to know your roots. My people need to be educated to overcome the legacy of enslavement. So this is this is the young lady. Now she's saying that now that she's grown into television, she's growing into the idea of being a role model who could inspire black Iraqis. I'm trying to demonstrate that my example can be a hope for everyone, that the color of my skin will not stop us. So as I spoke to a lot of people, especially given the widespread labor migrations that are happening from the rest of Africa to the Middle and Near East, this issue of the treatment of black people in the Arab world came up, and I thought that it reinforced that kind of division, because whether we're dealing with people like Chinwezu or Aikweyama, etc., part of the objection of including Arabs in a conception of Pan-Africanism is because of these origins of slavery, which have still not been confronted, they believe, in the Arab world. So when we, I think yesterday in Fatima's film, talking about people going to Libya, etc., we know that until the collapse of the Libyan state under Gaddafi, at least popular imagination in Ghana associated Libya and still does associate places like Dubai and other places in the Middle East with prosperity and with migration. And many people dreamed of returning to Ghana with a fortune. At the same time, we have many videos circulating in Ghana and in communities of the treatment of especially domestic workers, women who come to work in the Middle East and the Arab world and live under the kafala system, where they have few rights and little protection from their employers and employees. And so part of the morning when we arrived at the airport, just looking at Ghanaian families settling in, I could not help but think of these new African diasporas that are developing in the Middle East, and whether they become liberatory spaces for Africans or more of the same. And insistently in my interviews, people kept saying in the Arab world, there are Africans, but little consciousness of being African. Because especially also when they are Muslim, because in Islam, all become brothers and sisters, but they insist that discrimination still exists, and that the color issue in the Middle East is something that has not been transcended and that needs to be confronted. So as I know I don't have much time, but the questions that I ask myself about these persistent divides in Pan-Africanism around enslavement, around color, and around, of course, ultimately, around power, forces us to think about how we could construct different futures and build new relations. And as I came to the Africa Institute, one of the questions on my mind is that there are very few, even as there are few African institutes or centers in the Middle East, there are virtually no centers or institutes of the Middle East in Africa. And much of our knowledge of each other is always mediated, especially by the news media, which presents Arabs and Muslims as violent people, and which feeds into a fundamentalist Christianity that also really sets people apart. So if I think of Ghana, for instance, we now have centers of European studies. We have a Confucius Institute. Where is our Center for Middle Eastern Studies that would really allow us to pursue knowledge of each other and do, okay, I've seen you, break down so foster closer ties, appreciate the historical ties that we have, and also facilitate more exchange and knowledge of each other. I think that the exchange of faculty and students could also be the building block of establishing African content in the training of students in the wider Afro-Asian region, as well as in our regions in Africa, of allowing us to understand and experience the Middle East in a way different from just seeing Arab states as a source of aid and cash in increasingly constrained circumstances. So I believe that the voices, and it echoed with something that Hor said yesterday about the first symposium that was held in this institute, the conversation between African and Arab or Middle East scholars. And I think that if this is properly done, the metaphorical Sahara as a bridge, not a barrier, could do much to facilitate interactions between the two regions. And we know that already there are many ties, many people speak Arabic, etc., but they think of it more in a religious than in a material and cultural way. So a revised, re-energized, and a more people-centered approach could foster interactions in the hope of reducing the condescension, the tensions, and contradictions that presently mark the largely one-sided employment relations that people have and the kind of aid mentality that governments in our regions have. So an expansive, as I stated earlier, the expansive vision of Pan-Africanism that has characterized the relationship between the two regions is something that we could seek to further develop for our mutual enrichment. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. So I would like to echo what my colleagues said and thank the organizers and note that I have a very tall job because I've been put at the tail end of an amazing panel. So my name is Mjiba Frehewat, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute of African Studies. And when I got here, I realized, as amazing as I am and as, great of a speaker I am, I thought I wanted to let the masses tell the story, and I would fill in some of the blanks. So please bear with me as the masses speak through my presentation. So here we go. So the question is, why do we refer to people who were born and live in the diaspora as African? So as you can hear, I speak a colonial language imposed on us, English, with an accent of another colonial language, German, because I was born in Germany and I live in Germany. Nevertheless, I belong to Africa. I am African, and I fight for the African liberation and unity. But why is that so? So for that, I would like to quote Kwame Nkrumah. So he said that all people of African descent, whether they live in the North or South America, the Caribbean, or any part of the world, are African and belong to the African nation. And that is the great thing about Pan-Africanism. So even if I live in Germany or any other country in the world, I am still an African, because I recognize that our core interest and progress as people is intrinsically linked to the liberation of Africa. So the AAPRP, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, recognizes that all African people, born and living all over the world, are one people with one identity, one history, one culture, one nation, and one destiny, an African destiny. So we do not see the term people as a biological unit, but as a political, sociological, and historical entity. So the total liberation and unification of all African people worldwide is the highest and most important goal for us. And this can only be achieved through collective organization in Africa and in the diaspora. So this is a sister in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And the All African People's Revolutionary Party is an organization that Kwame Nkrumah called for in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, which he rewrote when he was in Guinea as the co-president after the coup d'etat. So my discussion today is departure from colonialism and return to a Pan-African personality.
So today I'm just going to be very brief, and I already have 16 minutes left, so let me get myself together. I'll do an introduction, a brief overview of the methods. I'll really talk a little bit about what the Pan-African personality is, have some key findings, and then want to look at some Pan-African political organizations today that have been influenced by Kwame Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism. So when I think about this notion of Pan-Africanism in the diaspora, we recognize that the historic diaspora has roots in West Africa. Ghana and Senegal are generally the two countries that come up because of the overwhelming number of slave dungeons. There's this connection to Africa that transcends through historical memory in the diaspora, something that one cannot explain, but something that is in your DNA. And as you grow and develop as an African in the diaspora, you find yourself tied to, connected to the African continent. There's this notion of African identity that transcends space and time and geography, right? And it impacts this identity construction of the diaspora. And sometimes what tends to happen in spaces like the US, there's this heavy propaganda against Africa and African identity. And so what happens is, as one grows and develops, this African identity fights its way to the top or the fore of one's consciousness. And then there's these real and imagined linkages that exist between the African diaspora, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ghana. And I think it's important to note that Kwame Nkrumah was intentional in engaging with the diaspora while in the US, like at Lincoln University, a historically Black university and college. He was a member of several political organizations, including founding the African Students Association. And as we heard, which I will not go over, he was in, the UK working with George Padmore and W.E.B. Du Bois around the Fifth Pack. And I think that this is a really important point to note, that he was also organizing with West African students with the West African Student Union and other organizations that really had a forward-thinking view of Pan-Africanism, and particularly they began with this notion of West African Pan-Africanism. And I think that these relationships really informed his ideas and practice when he traveled back home to join the fight for independence. And I think this is particularly important, is that his interactions with the diaspora and in these various organizations really concretized his understanding of Pan-Africanism and the role that the diaspora would play in Ghana. And then, of course, with independence, he welcomed the diaspora home. And I think what was exciting to the diaspora, that Ghana was the center of Pan-Africanism at that moment. And I'm going to quickly move on, but I think it's really important to note that oftentimes W.E.B. Du Bois is talked about as one of the quintessential diasporans that came to Ghana. But I want to focus on Shirley Graham Du Bois, right? Because W.E.B. Du Bois, I love Du Bois, he was amazing, but he was in Ghana for 2 years. And after W.E.B. made his transition, Shirley Graham Du Bois, she was very instrumental in Ghana's development, particularly around radio and television. And she moved around the global south for the most part, representing Ghana. And there's a story that I like to tell. After the coup d'etat, she escaped to Egypt after she had been imprisoned in Ghana, and there was a independent African states conference, and she came in as just a press person, and she went to the press galley, and the organizers came and they were like, "Oh, Mrs. Du Bois, please, you should come to the floor." She's, no, I've come here to be the press. That was the first day. The second day, she came and they tried to get her to come down to the galley again, and she said, no, I've come to be the press. The third day, they just grabbed her and moved her and brought her down to the galley, and they asked her, "Can you read Kwame Nkrumah's intervention, because he sent it from Guinea?" And she got up and she said, "My name is Shirley Graham Du Bois, and I'm a Ghanaian." She said, and I'm representing my president, Kwame Nkrumah, and the Convention People's Party. This is after the 1966 coup d'etat. And so she really embodied being a Ghanaian, right? She really embodied this notion of Pan-Africanism. And as a diasporan, she then dedicated ultimately the rest of her life to pushing for Pan-Africanism and defending Kwame Nkrumah. And moving on. So very quickly, I had two real questions. What role did or does Kwame Nkrumah have on the Pan-African consciousness building in the diaspora? And how has Kwame Nkrumah and Ghana influenced Pan-African political organizations? The research occurred between 2018 and 2020 in DC, Oakland, and Accra, Ghana. And we did in-depth interviews and focus group discussions. So I wanted to start with this notion of the Pan-African personality. And in Conscientism, Nkrumah says, our philosophy must find its weapons in the environment and living conditions of the African people. It is from those conditions that the intellectual content of our philosophy must be created. The emancipation of the African continent is the emancipation of man and woman. This requires two aims. First, the restitution of the egalitarianism of human society, and second, the logistic mobilization of all our resources towards the attainment of that restitution. And so when I think about the African personality, I'm thinking about this notion of rooting our resistance in the philosophy, in African people's philosophy. Nkrumah also says the African personality is itself defined by the cluster of humanist principles which underlie the traditional African society. And I would like to add that the Pan-African personality is a set of ideas, principles, and values that drive the resistance and resilience of African people to fight for the liberation and unification of Africa and African people. And so we did a lot of interviews, about 17 interviews and focus group discussions, and a couple of things we found. We found that Pan-Africanists, organization and individually, credit Kwame Nkrumah with their ideological transformation. We realized that oftentimes the first contact with Africa was through Ghanaian ideology. So oftentimes, particularly in the US, because this is what we're dealing with, you see Akan priestesses, and they were trained in the US, right? You see people talking about Akan mythology or even quoting Sankofa, Adinkra symbols, not recognizing that it is Akan ideology or theology, but really everything is Ghanaian, right? And so oftentimes, unfortunately, like you can even have djembe. Some people can be playing a djembe drum, and you then connect that to Ghana. Somehow, much of Africa and African culture in the diaspora is connected to Ghana. And then many students, they studied abroad, right? And so when they were exposed to this work, Ghana, through the works of Maya Angelou, Du Bois, and even Shirley Graham Du Bois. And the studying abroad was also a very pivotal moment in many people's consciousness building. And then oftentimes, the majority of our interviewees, they identified as African or Black, but tied it often to Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah. And so I'm going to quickly pass through this because I only have 8 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we hear two more voices. And I want to just read some of the key findings. One of my respondents said, I am an African living in America. All Africans are connected, and we have a responsibility to each other. So there's this notion that they're an African in America. Everybody is connected. Another said, I lived in Ghana when I was 10 years old with my mother. It reinforced that I see myself as an African and are part of African people. I am sure that experiencing a different culture at that young age impacts you. And then I have some respondents that said, my heart has been gravitating towards Ghana. I have a friend from Ghana. I heard it's very safe in Ghana, right? And then this is interesting, which I've heard many people say. The moment I got off the plane, I felt something. I can't explain it. When you get off the plane, that heat hits you, that Ghanaian sun hits you. I can't explain it. It just felt like home. I came home. And then I'm going to quickly move on. So then there's Pan-African organizations, because I have 7 minutes. There's Pan-African organizations in the diaspora that have been directly impacted by Nkrumah. When I say directly impacted, I mean many people embrace Nkrumah's ideology as the ideology that their organization is driven by. Many look to Ghana as a liberatory space during 57 to 66 and even today. Many read Kwame Nkrumah and even look at the institutions that Ghana and Nkrumah founded and organized during the heyday. And some of the institutions that are quoted is the All-African People's Organization, of course, which organized the All-African People's Conferences, the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute, the Ghana Young Pioneer Movement, and of course, the Bureau of African Affairs. So here is a picture of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party's website, which the young woman spoke at. We see that, boom, right on the front page, there is a quote by Nkrumah. And this organization is an Nkrumah's Tereus organization. And then there's an organization in East Oakland, right? And East Oakland is what we call the hood in Oakland. And people are, you know, the petty bourgeois and white residents in Oakland have always been afraid to go to East Oakland. Now they're buying everything up, which is a whole nother issue. But there's an organization called the Black Cultural Zone. And if you can look closely, you can see that on this side, I don't know if I can point. Yeah, we see black, but we see the Sankofa bird, right? We see this notion of, you know, the creation of political, social, cultural, and economic liberation, right? So there's this notion of liberation even inside of East Oakland. And then, of course, we see that they have an Akoma outdoor market. This is an Adinkra symbol, right? We see this. The time is now to transform internally, ideologically, interpersonally, and institutionally, right? So all of these things tie back to this notion of Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism. This right here is an organization, the National Black United Front, and this is on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Boulevard in Southeast Washington, D.C. And they have a program called Feed the Hood, and they collect food and goods, and they come out and they feed the community, right? And they're feeding because this notion of self-determination, and their mantra is forward ever, backwards never, and we know how that connects to Nkrumah. And National Black United Front has been in the forefront of Black Lives Matter movements and pushing back against police brutality and even multiple forms of oppression in Washington, D.C. So I want to show a short clip.
It's not just the issue of being black, it's that you're black and poor. Yeah. And it's that they want you to stay that way. So they're going to get all the guns, change all the laws, get tanks, get body armor, get drones, whatever they can get. Because they're not going to solve poverty, they're not going to solve unemployment, but they will put a militarized police force to make sure you don't get too mad about it. Shut it down! It's not.
So I just wanted to note a couple of pieces of symbolism. One, there's a red, black, and green flag, right? Two, you have folks with the National Black United Front shirts and forward ever, backwards never. Three, you had folks moving around in, it was China-made kente, but it was still kente cloth, right? Which represented this notion of Pan-Africanism and liberation. And then three, of course, you have someone playing the djembe. And again, oftentimes we associate the djembe with Ghana, which we know that the association isn't exactly correct, but there's this notion of like this West African unity, even in the diaspora. And then you have the African People's Socialist Party. And this is their Burning Spear newspaper. And you can see that between a rock and a hard place, the All African People's Development, right? That's, boom, a straight up, you know, connection to the All African People's Conferences. And then one thing, I have 3 minutes left. The one thing that I also want to note is that in 1972, the African Liberation Support Committee was a major organization in Washington, D.C., really the U.S., that organized around African Liberation Day, right? And so I want us to see a clip of a march, the largest African Liberation Day march in Malcolm X Park in northwest Washington, D.C., organized by the African Liberation Support Committee. And the African Liberation Support Committee did everything from organizing marches to organizing, rallies for anti-apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement, divestment, et cetera, et cetera.
Africa is gonna win! Africa is gonna win! Long live People's War! Long live People's War! People's War is gonna win! People's War is gonna win!
You see Nkrumah in the background.
African Liberation Day, which is traditionally celebrated throughout the African world each May 25th, was the occasion this year for the largest all-black assembly ever held in Washington, D.C. More than 30,000 blacks, representing a wide cross-section of political ideologies, gathered at the culmination of a two-day conference on Africa. The underlying themes behind the conference and march were to heighten the awareness of blacks in this country to the plight of our brothers and sisters in Africa, to create some ongoing organization that would actively aid black freedom fighters in those African countries still under white colonial rule, to begin to link our future as a self-determined, free people with that of Africans, and to begin to act as a unified body of blacks who will influence U.S. policy towards Africa.
And so I want to just end with a quote by Nkrumah at the All African Peoples Conference. He said, "This mid-20th century is Africa's. This decade is a decade of African independence. Forward then to independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa." Thank you very much. Power begins with conception.
Okay. Wow, thank you. Those just really fit so sort of seamlessly together. So I want to thank each of you for just really lovely presentations that opened up so many questions and facets of Pan-Africanism's past, present, and future. We got kind of an overview, a longer history, and we could see the sort of Anglophone kind of origins of Pan-Africanism. We watched it evolve out, and then we see Ghana emerge as sort of a crossroads, but also a place where people came and debated what the future of the world should look like. We also then followed the diaspora to parts of the world where we often don't recognize diaspora. Why is that? So Techiwa, thank you for that. And then Jiba, thank you for taking us right to the present and to the importance of those same questions. They're as important today as they were 100 years ago. There are a lot of ways I could do this, but I'm not going to do it in a typical way. I do have specific questions for everybody, but I'm not going to do that. Is that okay? Okay, I think people in the audience can do that. So what I want to do is just raise 3 questions that came to me as I listened, and I thought, I wonder. So the first question has to do about the nation state. So what we're watching unfold after 1957 is a world that it's now been determined after the Second World War is going to be based on the idea of the nation state. Either you make a nation state or you're kind of out of the game. So Nkrumah understood that, and he wasn't too happy with it, but he thought he could play the game and then sort of get rid of the nation state with his United States of Africa. So Ghana was this sort of safe haven, an incredible safe haven for people to debate Pan-Africanism and the future of the world. But then if you have tethered your Pan-African vision to a nation state, then what happens in 1966 when that state apparatus is destroyed and much that went with it? So I wanted to think sort of politically and strategically about the relationship of the nation state to this Pan-Africanist radical project, from origins to the present. I would really like to talk further, and I think Mjiba started that conversation for us in really interesting ways, about the power and the possibilities of Pan-Africanism today at this current juncture and moving forward. And then I think Techiwa poses, her work actually poses questions about that as well. And Robert, I'm thinking all those questions sort of reflect, too, you and Hakeem both, about place. And when we look at histories of Pan-Africanism through sort of the nation state, so there's a South Africa story. And I was taught the South Africa story was the ANC, and then there's this split in 1958. And we don't understand that none of this was actually, people weren't thinking in those terms. in those nation-state terms. And so you did such a great job of showing that the Ghana story and the South African story are actually the same story, and they're co-constitutive. And I thought that was really terrific. So that's a second one, the power and the possibility. And then I don't have this expertise. Techiwa has some, but I'm hoping people in the audience too. Hakeem, maybe you have something to say to this too, about the ways that the Pan-Africanist movement has moved across the world, who's been incorporated, who's sort of not, who seems to be on the margins of it. As we look at the Gulf today, the Middle East, South Asia, what are the first of all, the why nots, and then how-tos. So those were the things that I sort of left me at the end of 4 wonderful presentations. So I'd be happy to hear responses to any of that, incoherent though it was, and then we can open it up to the audience. Thoughts on any of it?
I'm not really sure which part of your questions or statement I'm addressing, but I think that you could say that historically Pan-Africanism has developed. I started off by saying Pan-Africanism is like a river with many streams and currents. So, but the necessity for Pan-Africanism, or the reason for its existence, is to address particular problems, particular challenges, especially political questions and problems, colonialism, imperialism, racism, and so on. So, and historically people have united to deal with those problems across borders, across continents, across, and that process continues. So that means it's not limited to any particular, what you call a nation state. I'm not sure if in Africa we have nation states. Nation states tend to be, anyway, emerged in Europe, and even in Europe, it's not always clear whether they're nation states. But anyway, historically, people have got together to address these problems. And I don't see that necessarily changing. What has changed is the nature of the problems has changed and become more complex. So, for example, one of the tensions within Pan-Africanism very broadly is the fact that you now have African governments that have their own Pan-African organizations and so on, such as the AU. And of course the AU recognizes the diaspora as its 6th region and so on. But the tension has been because organizations like the AU don't really seem to be addressing any of the major problems that face Africans in the continent or in the diaspora. So, but I think people still have the aspiration to organize jointly as Africans globally to address and overcome these problems and find ways of doing that. And even something like, Black Lives Matter, you could see as a modern formation of Pan-Africanism. The other thing is that Pan-Africanism and Black Lives Matter is a good example. It's not historically exclusive either. It doesn't mean that people are not Africans shouldn't be involved. And the thing I was trying to stress about the Pan-Africanism that emerged at the end of the Second World War is it had that internationalist character to it. So anyway, that's what I would say in response to the points that you raised.
Techiwa?
Thank you, Jean. I wanted to respond to the issue of those on the margins of Pan-Africanism, if I may, because it's not just in the Middle East. I think Yeah, was it Salah saying yesterday or the day before at the opening of the conference about how because Africa is the cradle of humankind, when you stepped out of Africa, you found black people everywhere. Some consciously as a result of slavery, but I mean, if you think of Tongans in the Pacific, sure, they also have African ancestry. The issue sometimes has to do with the consciousness of being African or wanting to link up with Africa. So in the Iraqi example, the fact that there are 1.5 million Africans, black Iraqis, who really play very little role in the political system of Iraq. And when I read about black people singing or playing comedic roles on TV, it reminded me of when I lived in Colombia more than 2 decades ago. And the only time, at some point I lived with a black woman in her house, but the only time I saw black people on TV was La Negra Grande. So you'd have a black woman who would appear and sing the blues or something. This is before the development of the Afro-Colombian movement and all of that. So I think that in our own conceptions of Pan-Africanism, we tend to look more at the Atlantic, but not look further east and those kinds of connections, So if we have this internationalist outlook, if we're looking at the conditions of black people everywhere, which was the Garveyite thing, where when, like go anywhere, look at where are their governments, all of those kinds of things, it's there. And then as I read, I also thought about Du Bois and the kind of double consciousness, So these are people who, whether they like it or not, they're treated as less than citizens in those countries that they live. But also because of religion and other things, there is a kinship, but that kinship is not stepsisters and brothers, adopted sisters, I don't know. So it does raise for us all the future, and I think the Black Lives Matter movement is spreading, and it's having inroads that maybe people did not think about, because it helps people to get this consciousness of what they are like, how they're being treated in their societies of settlement. And I think that it raises both the intellectual and the programmatic questions for us, and this kind of internationalism, which to a large extent has been dented or constricted by the nation state form, because now you kind of mind your own business, So as I interviewed Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials in Ghana, I felt frustrated because it was not, the issues that they were raising was not about internationalism, was not about Pan-Africanism, it was about Ghana and Ghana's own economic relations and what Ghana could gain from developing relations with the Arab world, rather than a people-to-people relationship. And unfortunately, when you come down to the people-to-people relationship, most of it is through these labor migrations, where people are really being oppressed, denied their rights in those countries where they live. So it does then get us to the Pan-Africanism of the future, and what kinds of alliances, relationships, even intellectual projects that arise for us.
Well, certainly every single one of Nkrumah's Pan-Africanist projects in Ghana, based in Ghana, they were the first things that the military government dismantled in 1966. So their power was understood. Robert, did you?
Yeah, I'm thinking about your question. I think you said this early in the introduction, that Pan-Africanism is something that, at least in the diaspora, is born on the water, right? So through the process of enslavement. And so we can think about we can think about a history of Pan-Africanism that can begin with marriage, with slave rebellions, with anti-slavery movements. If we move into the 19th century, those anti-slavery movements are also anti-colonial movements.
Right.
We have to center Haiti. And so there's a space to talk about the development of a Republic Haiti, the type of nation state, but that is Pan-Africanist in the sense that it's aiding anti-slavery, anti-colonial movements elsewhere throughout the Western Hemisphere. So I think there's something there about a nation state that is still an anchor, if you will, toward a broader type of Pan-Africanism. Mm-hmm. And I think Nkrumah's Ghana, Nyerere's Tanzania are inheritors of that earlier tradition with Haiti.
That's right.
And I think that what the PAC was trying to get at in this case, or really latching onto with this idea of a United States of Africa, was not so far off from what Lutuli and the ANC was trying to get at, with a sort of broader sense of a continental Pan-Africanism, Afro-Asian solidarities. So I think the difficulty in thinking through Pan-Africanism is, I think there's clarity about what one is against as a Pan-Africanist, various forms of white supremacy, colonialism, land dispossession, economic exploitation. It's a trickier matter to work through, I think, the intra-racial dynamics where one has to think, sometimes fight against racial hierarchies within racial formations. So we see it in the Garvey movement, where diasporic blacks are regarded as sort of senior partners. And I think the Pan-Africanism of post-1945 is far more equitable in terms of relationships within black communities. And I think the ongoing challenge now, when we think about Pan-Africanism now, is how to formulate Pan-Africanism when the agents of oppression look like us. So how do we think through a Pan-Africanism that, although the origins and the energy is race-based, because white supremacy in its various forms, it's not going anywhere, right? It mutates and shape-shifts, right? But then the problematic is, let's say, after the end of the anti-apartheid movement, we've struggled to, for instance, if we look at Abacha in Nigeria, for instance, in the early 1990s, we struggled to formulate a Pan-African response.
That's a really good point.
And think through how is our Pan-Africanism when the target is not white folk here, there, and everywhere as an easy target. And I think that's the ongoing challenge. So I think we do have a Pan-Africanism that can work within and beyond the nation-state formulation. I think we're nimble enough to do that. I think it's the problematic of race and the way that we think intra-racially. How do we navigate our Pan-Africanism against or right in that dynamic of when it's not an obvious target of a white supremacist, as serious as that is, right? That for me, the greater challenge is our intraracial relation with each other. We're thinking about Pan-Africanism in the 21st century.
That's great, yeah. Jiba.
Yeah, so I think this notion of where does Pan-Africanism go in the 21st century, I think I'd like to kind of maybe pick up on. And this is because I think that in the 21st century, well, let me say this. This notion of how do we promote Pan-Africanism when the oppressor or repressor looks like us, I think is a very interesting question. Because although Marcus Garvey said every black man is an African, I think we have to reevaluate who an African is, right? I think we have to ask, is an African someone, can you identify someone as an African if they're actively exploiting their people? Can you identify someone as an African if they are, blindly conspiring with, capitalists to take, coltan or major resources, out of the continent. If folks are ideologically ignorant about sort of the ramifications of stealing, billions of dollars and stuff like that, okay, maybe we can have a conversation. But if one is tied, through their class and education to the West and to this global North, global South power dynamic, I would question whether they're an African, right? I would suggest that we need to move away from the current state apparatus, and we need to move to the base. We need to move to where the masses are, and the masses are organized, but are they organized towards unity, or are they organized for some other matters, right? I think that when we begin to look at individual acts of Pan-Africanism on the ground at this moment throughout global Africa, we'll see that there is a desire and excitement for Pan-Africanism. I think the missing link oftentimes is a loose enough ideology or principles or values to kind of tie those things together and tie these various organizations and institutions together. And I think that you can't be okay, let me not say you can't be. I'm very skeptical of internet YouTube Pan-Africanists, right? One is not beholden to a body that has principles, a collective process where if you are acting anti-African, you are held to account, right? So I think that there needs to be bona fide institutions like the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute, like the Ghana Young Pioneer Movement, from inception to a year later, there was 500,000 youth in this movement, right? And so I think that, so for me, I think that that's the first issue, is that we need to stop thinking that the African Union or ECOWAS or any state apparatus is going to be pushing Pan-Africanism, because quite frankly, it's not in their interest, right? And so we need to be asking whose interest is a Pan-African movement really in, and in my estimation, it's the masses. And then the next thing I think that's really important is that I think we have to be clear that Africa is for Africans, right? But that doesn't mean that we must not work with other oppressed folks, right? And so one of the clips we didn't get to see because of time, in one of the Black Lives Matter movements, someone was waving a Palestinian flag, right? So we have to also draw these connections between Pan-Africanism and internationalism without somehow saying, yes, Africa is for everybody. Because you can't say Africa's for everybody when African people are not benefiting. Like if African people were benefiting and there was abundant resources and everybody was eating every day, then maybe we can have a conversation about Africa being for everybody. But, and I'll stop here, I'll just say this, that I have heard a brother out of the Irish, at the point he was in the Irish Republic Party or something like that. And his understanding and analysis of Pan-Africanism at the moment was the sharpest that I had heard. I was like in my 20s, right? He was clear that Africa was for Africans, but he was clear that Pan-Africanism would help to liberate Ireland, right? And so I think that when we're thinking about how Pan-Africanism can really transform humanity, it's not just a question of Africa, right? It's a question of if Africa unifies, Africa will transform humanity, and humans around the world would live in different conditions. And so viewing Pan-Africanism from that view, right, in my estimation, I think will push it to the fore instead of debating who should or who shouldn't be part of the Pan-African movement, right? And then my last thing is, I think this notion of being an African and contributing to the Pan-African movement and the liberation of Africa, and Africa being primary, you don't have to be on the continent to do that. And I think sometimes we are confused about where your space and whether you're dedicated and committed to Pan-Africanism. You could be sitting in the moon and be talking about Africa needs to be unified for African people to be free. So I think this is also a way we need to shift our thinking. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have about a little over 10 minutes left, so is it okay with you all if we open it up? Yeah?
Hi. So my name is Nairi Blankenberg. I'm the director of the National Museum of African Art in DC, and I am actively trying to build a global African 21st century art museum. And I guess my question to the entire panel is getting you to reflect on the role of history and what you've just presented in providing me and our team with the tools to do so. I'm quite interested in all of your talks. I think laying the historical groundwork that you did, Hakeem, was fantastic. Robert, I went to Dubai Expo yesterday and enjoyed the African pavilions and the African Union pavilion and was struck at the narrative, the differentiating narratives in all of them. But I've also just been in South Africa, where I'm from, over the last 2 weeks, which is probably at the height of its xenophobia that I've ever seen. And I was interested, certainly, in the African Union, because the first speech that comes in is Thabo Mbeki's I Am an African, which is a more modern manifestation that I would say has largely failed of the Pan-African feeling in South Africa. But that being said, I don't think either South Africa or the USA are actually kind of the parameters through which Pan-Africanism, we can look at it. And I say that because I'm actively banning almost kente cloth and djembe drums in the museum right now, because I feel that Africa has to be seen as more than an origin story for an American narrative. And it is very difficult for me to forge a Pan-Africanism that isn't that isn't static in 2 moments of history. Nkrumah's Ghana, American origin story. And to start a conversation that is a lot more now and complex, perhaps. And I just wonder, and I turn to you guys for help in that, because I really need help in developing those frameworks to be able to move forward. Tall order, but.
I think what I'd like to do is get 3 questions on the table, and that'll let people pick and choose. So, Dede?
Hakeem, you talked about the importance of the 1952 Kumasi Conference in establishing the idea of a Soviet-style West African state as a precursor to the United States of America. Sorry, as a precursor to the United States of Africa. And then later you talked about the unfortunate aspect of the 1958 All-African Peoples Conference in establishing the divisions that were later to emerge. Now, one of those divisions was that between Nkrumah and Nyerere about whether we should have building blocks or go straight to a Pan-African Union, with Nyerere arguing that sub-regional blocks were necessary and Nkrumah arguing that that would hold back the unification of Africa. But did Nkrumah then, does it mean that Nkrumah changed his mind from when he and Padmore were pushing for a West African state? And given that today's context of the push towards under the African Continental Free Trade Area, the push to have a united Africa, what do you think we've learned from those two, the differences that were emphasized in those 2 conferences?
Thank you. And then...
sorry, those were touched on, so those issues were touched on also by Robert and Njiba. So.
Okay. Someone from back in that area.
Oui, bonjour à tout le monde. Moi, j'ai beaucoup de questions, mais je vais me restreindre au minimum. Hein. Alors, on parle de beaucoup de choses de l'Union africaine. Moi, je n'ai jamais vu quelque chose de très positif de l'Union africaine. Quand on sait les grandes séparations à l'intérieur, quand on voit que des États très loin de la région, je parle en l'occurrence de l'État d'Israël, qui veut être nommé par le président actuel de l'OUA, qui est du Tchad, il voulait être comme observateur, Israël observateur de l'unité africaine. Vous me direz, c'est surréaliste, mais c'est ce qui se joue aujourd'hui. وش نعمل؟ يقول لك ما فيش.
Naminata? Naminata, could you?
Tu veux traduire? J'ai rien compris.
Naminata can give a short. Could you bring a mic?
OK. Bon, OK, ça c'est une chose. Non, non, j'ai pas
Please.
fini. 2 secondes. Non, non, parce qu'il y a des choses très importantes dont il faut qu'on parle. Moi, je viens d'Algérie. Et il y a actuellement une migration énorme qui traverse mon pays. Il y a malgré tout beaucoup de racisme contre les Noirs. Alors qu'il y a beaucoup d'Algériens du Sud qui sont blacks. Dans ma propre famille, dans la confrérie de Tidjane, 90% sont black. Il y a eu une élection de Miss Algérie l'année dernière. Elle a été choisie parmi les femmes touareg. Il y a eu une levée de hurlements dans tout le pays. Comment Miss Algérie peut être noire? Et je ne vous dis pas des choses, il y en a plein. Bon, donc je me pose des questions. Est-ce qu'il ne faut pas éduquer aujourd'hui, démarrer avec les pays africains en même, les former contre le racisme, que ce soit dans les écoles, que ce soit dans les télés, les radios, le reste. Parce qu'on ne parle pas que des blancs occidentaux. Il y a les soi-disant blancs du nord de l'Algérie, dont je fais partie, avec lesquels il faut vraiment travailler profondément dans cette histoire. Mais il y a d'autres questions, mais je préfère m'arrêter là.
Merci.
In a nutshell, we need to educate the youth about racism, not just racism against the West, but also racism within, African countries and the relationship between African countries and the Arab world. Last year, I think the winner of the Algerian pageant was black, and there were scathing criticism as to the color of her skin. So these are things that we need to keep in mind in educating the youth. For the first point, that was about the African Union, which is a huge disappointment for him, especially when they take stands for or against Israel. So we need to think about Pan-Africanism, not just through the OAU, but also, through the average person. That's what I could remember.
Thank you so much. A lot on the table. Who'd like to start? Robert?
So I'm going to continue a thread I started with, but I think it might link. So Pan-Africanism, as we understand it, is a liberationist ideology and set of practices. And thinking about the nation state and thinking beyond the nation state, I think, and where we are now is with Pan-Africanism, I think we are moving beyond what we're against, whether it be in the past anti-slavery, anti-colonial, anti-white supremacist, in all of its forms, to think more clearly about what are we for. And when we think about Pan-Africanism of the 21st century and beyond, it's race, yes, but we also got to get straight on gender. We also got to get straight on sexual orientation, because at root, Pan-Africanism has been an ideology about affirming our humanity and all of its dimensions. And we have to do that work intra-racially, if you will, and beyond interracially. I think there's space for allies. So Pan-Africanism is race-based, yes. It's also tied to mentality. There's space for people who are not designated as black to be part of a Pan-African community. So thinking through that, I think, is where we go. Bring it back down from nation state to asserting our humanity in all of its dimensions, and having a Pan-Africanism that is capacious enough to bring in allies who have a particular mentality along those lines. So I think that's absolutely crucial about a Pan-Africanism that is pro going forward in the 21st century. Pan-Africanism, as I'm understanding it, is an emancipatory ideology and set of practices, primarily emanating from black people, and in many cases, the immediate beneficiaries might be black people, but it's an emancipatory project for the world. And I think that's something else we need to keep in mind when we think about the liberatory potential of Pan-Africanism. It's liberatory for the world, not just the black world, if you will. Sorry.
Okay. There were, in a sense, a couple of questions about history. And I think one of the problems that we have in the continent and the diaspora is that we don't really have a very great appreciation of history, knowledge in the kind of widest sense. So one of the kind of global problems that needs to be taken up is the history of Africa and Africans, and how that history is presented in such a way that it's enlightening to young people in particular. Just to give you an example, I come from Britain, where we have quite a lot, well, a population of people of African and Caribbean heritage. At universities at the moment, history is amongst young black people, history is the third most unpopular subject. Only veterinary science and agriculture are less popular than history. So the reasons for that are that history is generally presented in a Eurocentric manner, and young people are put off studying history. Now, I won't go into all the ramifications of that. But if history is taught in a Eurocentric manner for young black people, it means it's also taught in a Eurocentric manner for everybody else. So everybody has a kind of distorted view of the world and their own position within it, which is very, very dangerous. Of course, we all live in states, generally speaking, whether they're in the diaspora or in Africa, that generally speaking have an interest in preventing people from having a clear understanding of the world in which they live. And so the question of the state and whose state it is, whose political kingdom it is, are very important questions. And whether that's in Algeria or it's in the US or it's in Britain, it's essentially the same problem as who are the decision makers. At the moment, generally speaking, we're not the decision makers anywhere, so part of that global Pan-African or internationalist struggle is to transform things so that we can become the decision makers and have control over all these questions of education, history, and all of these things. So I think that whenever we consider these kinds of issues, we have to be clear that they're essentially political questions. If, to go back to Dede's question, if we go back to 1945 and so on, I said that they gave a very clear presentation of how they saw the problems existing in the world, the monopoly of capital, the alien political institutions within Africa, the colonial borders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they said that there was a very, clear solution and path forward, which was based around putting the masses of the people at the center. And it was the workers, farmers, and so on who would be the force to change society and liberate it. But in the course of that struggle, you could say, for independence and so on, many of these principles were lost sight of. And for a variety of reasons. Partly there was the impact of the Cold War at that period, which had and the superpower rivalry, which had a big impact on the struggles for independence in Africa. Partly there were kind of political expedience and pragmatism. If you look at what Nkrumah, Padmore, and others discuss all the time, it's, let's get hold of the political kingdom and then we can do what we like. Well, you can't do that. That's not correct. Because the political kingdom that they were trying to grab hold of belonged to the enemy. And if you do that, you renounce the principle of alien political institutions, impose all these kinds of things. You have somebody else's system, which is essentially there to oppress you and so on. So there were a lot of problems which I didn't want to go into in my talk, but they're important questions because when we talk about how different the world is today, you know, Nkrumah, Fanon, and others in a very early period analyzed, particularly in Africa, what kind of world it was, and they coined a particular phrase to explain or to explain or give a term for that world. And, you know, we're still living in that world. People like to talk, I heard in previous discussions about post-colonialism, which seems to me complete nonsense. Because how can you say that the African continent is in a post-colonial period when the anti-colonial struggle hasn't yet been taken to its conclusion? And all the political institutions, all the economic institutions are those that existed during colonial rule. So to talk about post-colonialism, it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so I think that all of these questions were not resolved. The principles were there, but then there were problems. And then obviously there were the pressure of the big powers on some countries more than others, led to all these divisions that we're familiar with of Casablanca and Monrovia and so on. So there were a lot of problems in this period, and I think that when we tend to celebrate the successes and political independence and so on, but we have to recognize the shortcomings of that history and that period as well. So that's what I would say.
I'm getting the giant stop sign from Satan here in the front row. Taj has passed over his duties. So we're going to have to draw this to a conclusion, but I'm hoping over lunch that we could continue the conversation in smaller groups with food. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all for 4 fabulous presentations.
For your convening.